Hi everyone, Daljeet Peterson here from astrolab21.com, and welcome to our continuing series Blueprint of the Soul, where we're learning to become the architects of our own destiny by learning to read our astrological birth chart, our blueprint, if you will. So essentially what I'm doing here is an Astrology 101 series. I'm giving you the fundamentals, the basics to learning how to speak the language of astrology and learning how to read your own chart, which I believe is a super valuable tool for learning about ourselves, learning about life and relationships and everything that goes with it. So I'll make the disclaimer that I do at the top of all these videos that if you're just coming to this video and you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, strongly urge you to go back and watch those first, because you're just going to get so much more out of all of these episodes if you follow these in sequential order, because we are building on some of those earlier concepts and themes. So compiling all of these episodes in one playlist so they're easy to access, and it'll be a great resource for you to go back to again and again if you need to review them. I'm putting a link to the playlist in the description below. We'll pop a link up here in case you just want to jump into it now. And of course, if you are following along and continuing on this series, I'm glad to have you with us. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you're learning a lot and getting a lot out of this information. If you are following along, I hope you're clicking that like and subscribe button and hit that notification bell as well, so that you'll be alerted as new episodes in the series are produced and published. Okay, with that housekeeping out of the way, an appropriate phrase, because now we can pivot to the subject of this episode, which is the houses. Okay, I'm really excited about this episode on the houses because we're really going to now start to put a lot of these principles into action. We're going to actually start to build an actual chart and see how these principles are used in creating the blueprint, right? The blueprint of the soul, the astrological birth chart. And what we've learned so far with the discussion of the elements and the signs has really provided us with a lot of essential background information. But now as we move on to the subject of the houses, we're really taking this a layer deeper, and we're really going to get into the mechanics of how a birth chart is constructed. So a lot of information to convey to you in this episode. I've got some slides and some charts and some graphics to bring up and support, as I always do, which should help us to illustrate some of these topics. Also going to be showing you the astrology software that I use to do birth charts, that I use in my practice. So we'll start to see some of these principles put into action. I've also got a model of the solar system that I want to show you, because I always find it helps us to illustrate what astrology is trying to do, which is, right, it's a snapshot of the sky, of the solar system at the moment and place of birth, right? And this is the metaphor, this is the blueprint which our soul is working with in order to really grow and evolve in this lifetime. So lots to get to. Without further ado, let's jump in. And I just want to go back to where we kind of left off, which was, we've got our wheel of the zodiac that we've built using the 12 signs of the zodiac, right? And we've learned how we have kind of an under the hood, that we have elements and modes and polarities associated with each one of these signs of the zodiac. So we really have got this elemental foundational approach to the wheel of the zodiac. And so we're learning to see behind all of these signs of the zodiac is a lot more information encoded here. So now what I want to do is we're going to just pull away the zodiac itself and sort of let that fall into the background in a way. And you can see I still have the faint wheel of the zodiac, which correlates with the signs. There's Aries and the Ram and Taurus and the Bull, etc. And this is important because there's a relationship between the signs of the zodiac and the houses of the zodiac that's really important for us to understand and wrap our brains around. So we're going to rebuild the wheel again, as we did with the signs, starting with the circle, the wheel of life, and we're going to divide that circle into 12 equal parts. And as we did with the signs, we'll start here at the 9 o'clock position and work our way counterclockwise around the wheel. And basically, this is how we create the 12 houses of the zodiac. And again, there's this sort of rough correlation between the first house and the first sign, Aries, the second house and the second sign, Taurus, and so on. They're similar, but they're not the same, right? And if we refer back to our definitions of the 5 principles that we started with, remember we talked about the elements being the substance of experience. As we explored the signs, well, those were that elemental substance being expressed in these different qualities of experience. So the signs represent qualities. Now as we pivot and talk about the houses, what we're looking at are fields of experience, okay? So signs are qualities, houses are fields. So this is an important distinction that we want to start to make between these two very similar modalities within astrology. So what we have here with the 12 houses are really 12 parts of ourselves. And if you think about it, it's really important to know, we all have different personalities and we all use different parts of our personalities in different situations, right? The person that we are in, say, in our intimate relationships with our partners is much different than the person we are in the workplace with our coworkers or in that job review with our boss. Different still than we might be at home with our children or our siblings or our parents, right? We have different parts of ourselves that we use for different parts of life, different situations, and that's just normal. That's just part of being human. And so what we're learning and what the houses of the zodiac or the houses of astrology are describing are these different parts of ourselves. And essentially what astrology is sort of encoding is that there are really 12 aspects to the self. Each of these houses is going to represent a different part of ourselves. Now, I want to really start to orient us in a way. This is setting up the spine or the axis of the personality itself. And when we orient us to this first house and this first position, we want to start to think of this as being the direction of the east. And I'm going to show you why that's important in a second, because what it's orienting us to, what the house system is showing us is this is an orientation to both the time and place of our birth, right? And of course, we all know the day of our birthday is our sun sign, right? So if you were born on March 20th, on the first day of Aries, you're in Aries. We know that. But what we get with the birth data is not only the day, but we want to know the time and the place, because that's going to determine where our first house is, where our wheel of the zodiac starts. It's our orientation point. So when we talk about the first sign, we're going to talk about what we call the ascendant or the rising sign. What the rising sign is telling us is that in the time and place of our birth, if we were to look to the eastern horizon, this is the sign that will be rising in the east. We can also consider that this points from here to the sunrise, that the 10th house or the top of the chart points to noon, the 7th house to sunset, and the bottom is oriented to midnight. And this happens to do with where the planets are appearing at the time of our birth, as I'm going to demonstrate when we bring up the astrology software. So we've got east, west, north, south, and we've got sunrise, sunset, noon, and midnight. These are the prominent angles, the axis of the personality. And they're important, and each of these has a special designation, right? We call the first house the ascendant, right? And the 7th house, the opposite, is the descendant. Likewise, if we go straight up to the top of the chart at the 10th house, we get what's called the medium coeli, which is just Latin for mid-heaven or mid of the sky, and the imum coeli, which is bottom of the sky or the nadir. Okay, and don't get too bogged down with the terminology in the Latin. We abbreviate all these things as the ascendant, the descendant, the MC, which is the midheaven or medium coeli, and the IC, which is the nadir or the imum coeli. So these are just symbols that you're going to start to see as we start to look at birth charts, much like the symbols and the glyphs of the astrological signs. These are used in a chart to designate these 4 important points in any chart, this axis. And more importantly, not just the names of what these are, but I want you to really start to think about what these 4 points symbolize or represent. Because essentially the ascendant, we want to start to think of that as our front door, right? This is the part of ourselves that we use to present ourselves to the world. It's like you open the door to your personality and it's like, hello world, this is me, right? That's the part of ourselves, that's that first house that we're using to present ourselves to the world. Conversely, if we think about the seventh house and the descendant, we can think of that as our back door, right? Because this is where we let other people in through relationships. And often we're showing a different side of ourselves in that relationship than we do that we present publicly to the world, right? Our persona or our public-facing self is often very different than our intimate self that we share personally with our lovers and our husbands and wives, or our best friends or our closest colleagues. Likewise, we can think of the midheaven as sort of the roof, okay? Because the 10th house and the top of the chart represents the most public part of ourselves. This is associated with our career, with our fame and our reputation. So this is the part of ourselves we take out to work, that we take out in public, that we want to show everyone. I think of it as the roof of the chart. It's like the bird's eye view, right? If you think about when you look at like Google Maps or Google Earth, we've got that top-down view, and what are we seeing? We're seeing the roofs of all the buildings, right? Well, that's sort of the perspective that the 10th house gives us on the personality and on the birth chart. It's this bird's eye, very public view. Of course, the opposite of that down here in the IC, if we were to take this house metaphor further, I would probably have an illustration of a cellar or a basement or a foundation here, right? But I think even more appropriate is the idea of this being our roots, our foundation, really our family, our history, our past. All of these things are represented by the fourth house, and that's the part of ourselves that we use to establish our personality, our roots, our foundation. All right, so those are the symbols. Those are what I want you to start to see and think of. Behind these symbols are these concepts of front door, back door, roof, and roots. Again, this orientation, right? We talk about this, the ascendant, the first house being sunrise or the east. And I want to start to show you why that is so. So I'm got my astrology software up here, and I've basically cast a chart for what I'm calling a new soul. So we're going to pretend we have someone who was born on March 20th, 2021 at 7 o'clock in the morning here in Los Angeles, right? And of course, this is an important day, and I chose this day specifically because March 20th is the first day of spring. It's the spring equinox. So what we know about the spring equinox on the first day of spring is that the sun enters the sign of Aries. It's the beginning of spring. So 0 degrees Aries is where we're going to find the sun. Now what I want us to start to see is there's something very unique being represented here by the choice of this day and this time. Because what we have is an alignment between the sun and the rising sign. Because at 7 o'clock in the morning, as the sun rises on the spring equinox on March 20th, well, 0 degrees Aries is also going to be the rising sign or ascendant for this person being born on this time, in this place, on this day. And this is a very unique combination. So what are we doing here? What is this wheel of the zodiac trying to illustrate? Well, if I step over here to this other piece of software that's sort of showing me a perspective of the sky from the earth, from Los Angeles on that day at 7 o'clock in the morning. If we were to be standing in LA and looking due east, we would see that the sun is rising, and we know that that sun is at 0 degrees of Aries. So the rising sign, the ascendant, is always what is the part of the zodiac that is rising on the horizon due east at the exact time and place of birth. That is what this graphic is showing us. We always consider that the center of the wheel of the zodiac is the earth itself, right? Astrology is this geocentric system, literally earth-centered. So we're looking to the east. Remember we said this was the eastern direction, the first house, and that's what it's exemplifying, is this looking east at the time and place of birth, Los Angeles, on March 20th at 7 in the morning. this is the configuration. And we could see, if I were to pull out the atmosphere here, all the other planets are also in a certain position. And we could go back to, what are we seeing here? We're seeing, we've got Venus is near the sun, Mercury and Jupiter is higher in the sky. Well, if we were to bring up Mercury and Venus and Jupiter, those would be represented in our perspective here. And this is, I don't want to confuse this and get us ahead of ourselves. We're going to get to all that. I just want to merely illustrate what we're representing here. Now, here's a very important concept. Every 2 hours, the rising sign changes, right? So if I were to take this chart, let's say this soul was not born at 7 a.m. What if they were born 2 hours later at 9 a.m.? Well, now we can see the rising sign is pointing to somewhere in Taurus because the sun has moved up in the sky. Similarly, right, if we take our example here, if I were to move this to 9 o'clock, the sun in Aries much higher in the sky. But if we look at the point directly east at that time of birth, now what we're seeing is Taurus. And actually it's telling us it's 13 degrees of Taurus is that point in the sky. So now we have a very different chart and a different personality, essentially, right? Still in Aries, all day, no matter what time of day someone's born on March 20th, they're always going to be 0 degrees Aries. But what is going to change every 2 hours is their rising sign. So rather than that soul born at 7 o'clock that was Aries rising and Aries sun, that was a double Aries, right? You would have seen, if I go back, right, if we say this person, this is a real Aries signature. You're going to see this person as Aries a mile away, right? Because not only are they an Aries sun, right, their identity, their sense of purpose, their drive in life, they're going to be very Aries motivated. But as well, they're as an Aries rising, they would present themselves in a very Aryan way. They would be very aggressive and independent and impatient, right? All the things we learned about that fiery sign of Aries. Well, now, if the person would be born 2 hours later, right, this could be an entirely different personality. Now we have an Aries sun, but it's in the 12th house, right? This is the most we're going to find out. This is a very hidden house, the house of hidden things. So now that Aries personality is not so obvious. And we won't see it because what we have is a Taurus rising. So this personality would present themselves in a much different way. They would present themselves as Taurus, as being more earthy and feminine, right? And Venus ruled versus that Mars fire Aries sign. Totally different personality. And that's what's reflected, if we were to go another 2 hours, now the sun's even higher in the sky. And what would that show us astrologically? Well, now we would have a Gemini rising. And that Aries sun would be in the 11th house. So this might be a very socially oriented person. As we're going to learn, the 11th house is all about our social orientation. But that Aries sun now gets presented through a Gemini rising. Well, this person's going to be much more airy, much more communicative and expressive, and right? Just a different personality. So what's happening? Every 2 hours, we see that the zodiac sign that rises is changing. And then that is going to cause the planets to appear into different houses, right? If the same soul was born at high noon, now the sun is up in the top of the sky. It's in the 10th house. And now the sign of Cancer would be said to be rising. If we were to move this to noontime, right? The sun's way up high in the sky, but when we look directly east, this would be the part of the sky that's known as Cancer. So now we're talking about, once again, an entirely different personality type based on the rising sign, which is why this rising sign is so important. It really is the orientation point of the entire chart. We set the chart based on that time and place of birth, and that point directly east from that location is a very important symbol within the birth chart because it orients the entire chart. Where does it start? And so we see this slippage taking place. So we go from a very natural expression of first house being in Aries, right, to, okay, well, what if we have Taurus rising? well, now all of the other houses start to wear a different sign, right? If we have a natural zodiac, well, the second house would wear Taurus and the third house Gemini and so on. This is what's called the natural zodiac. People who are born Aries rising tend to have this very natural expression because all of their houses line up with the associated sign. But as we start to get different rising signs, now if we have Taurus rising, well, now we have Gemini on the second house, we have Cancer on the third house, and so forth, right? And so now this axis would be even different. This is what we would call a fixed personality. If we have a fixed sign rising, well, we have fixed signs on all of those four important axis points that we've been talking about, right? The ascendant and the descendant would be fixed Taurus and fixed Scorpio. The midheaven would be that fixed Aquarius, and the nadir would be that fixed Leo. Again, if we moved on and we had a Gemini rising, right? Now we have a personality that's going to be oriented with a more mutable axis, right? Gemini, the mutable sign, would be opposite the mutable sign of Sagittarius. We'd have mutable Pisces up on the midheaven, and we'd have mutable Virgo on the nadir, right? So this is a really important thing to start to understand. So hopefully you're starting to see some of that magic come alive when we look at this relationship between the houses and the signs, and how we use the rising sign based on the time and place of birth to determine where the wheel of the zodiac starts, how our birth charts are individually constructed, right? And we can think about this as almost like two wheels with one nested inside the other, with that inner wheel being those 12 houses, which is fixed and set by where the rising sign is, and then the outer wheel being the signs of the zodiac that rotates around depending on when that birth time takes place. So we can get different expressions based on different combinations of house and sign, which is, as we've demonstrated, how we could have someone with an Aries sun represented through 12 different rising signs, creating 12 very different personalities. And that's just using two factors, right? That's just using the sun and the rising. When we then bring into consideration all of the other planets and the different houses and signs that they're showing up in, well, then we get this much richer picture of the personality that we're dealing with, and how that personality might interact with another personality with a different chart, with planets in different signs, in different houses. And that's how we can look at composite charts and synastry, and how we can use astrology to really understand ourselves, our relationships, and other people around us. So hopefully you're starting to get a sense of some of the magic that's possible by understanding this very rich language of astrology, this symbol system. You're seeing it come alive, and we're starting to use some of the information that we've been learning along the way, right? All that we've learned about the signs is really valuable now as we apply them to the houses, because it's as if we can now see how, and what we're going to show in the next episode when we go into the second part of this exploration of the houses, we'll look at what each of those 12 houses represents. They're each a part of ourselves. But then what we learn is that for each of us, they're going to wear a different sign of the zodiac, right? If I go back to the graphic that we had, right? So this forms the axis. This forms the backbone of the birth chart, the house system, and oriented toward the rising sign. And then we start to apply, okay, which sign of the zodiac aligns with each of the houses depending on the rising sign. So we're going to get a myriad of different expressions based on that very unique combination. All right, fifth house is always going to be creativity, but do we have Gemini on that fifth house, or do we have Sagittarius on that fifth house? Well, that's going to give a different quality to how that aspect of self, that creative self-expression, gets expressed, and so on. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to cover in this episode, sort of to set the table for an understanding of the houses. Hopefully you followed along and you're starting to see the magic, see this all come together. In the next episode, we'll continue to explore the houses. We'll take a deep dive into each of those 12 houses in turn and examine which field of experience, which part of ourself each of those houses represents, and how we use those in different situations in life. And this will set the stage for future episodes where we get into the planets and the aspects, and then we'll really be ready to start to analyze our birth chart in a very meaningful and insightful way, because we'll have gained a real fluency with this language of astrology that we're learning to speak here. So hope that's been helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it. Again, like and subscribe if you're finding these videos helpful. Click the notification bell so you know when subsequent episodes in the series are released. And I look forward to seeing you next time. All right, till then, Sat Nam, everyone.